So who's up for exploring patterned paper? So we're going to look at patterned paper and also found paper as well. So things like book pages, all of those sorts of things, and go over some ideas for how to attach them to projects, and then also some ideas of how to actually just use them in projects as well. So yes, I am a bit of a pattern paper fiend. I have got quite a collection, particularly when I was card making a lot, and I no longer buy pattern paper. I try and use up the pattern paper that I've got, and it's particularly useful for collage, particularly as I can no longer use any of my pattern paper because it's so out of date, so I can't use it for any of the articles that I make. So it will end up in my mixed media projects. And the other thing that ends up in my mixed media projects are the event booklets and leaflets, and I've talked about these a lot because these are what I use as my junk journals, and they're literally just for messing around with, and I use them as found papers and also as actual journals. Then there are books, old books that I've picked up from charity shops or from library sales. And then you've got catalogues, say something like this that came in a newspaper, where the paper's just really lovely. If you can get one with a nice matte paper, then they're great to work with, and you can use them as found papers or as journals. Then you've got things like comic books as well, don't forget comic books. And other things I've seen people use are things like newspapers. I've used newspapers before, they're great fun. And also wallpaper, people who've used wallpaper in their art, or even those little colour swatches that you get for your paint, anything like that. So have a think about that. And then there's also the little bits and pieces like postage stamps, and also the postmarks you can get and things like that. And so have a look at your clothes as well. Sometimes there's some interesting little tags in your clothes, particularly the tags that come with the clothes. Sometimes they can be really pretty and very useful to actually work on as substrates, so do some tag altering, or to put into your projects. And then you have memorabilia, so things like tickets and receipts, and for when you're travelling or when you're going out and about or going to an event. They can be great fun to work with, and you have to be a little bit careful with those because sometimes they fade really quickly, like they'll only last like a couple of years. So what I tend to do with memorabilia, things like that, is I will, if I think it's going to fade, I will scan it into the computer, print it out on a paper that's going to last a bit longer with an ink that's going to last a bit longer, something archival, and use those in my project work instead. And then you get things that, you know, come in products, like this leaflet from Moleskine. I mean, it's supposed to be just chucked away in the recycle, but the paper's really lovely, so I use that. And then leaflets that I've picked up. This is a map that I've picked up from a station that's really handy. But there is also an issue with any kind of papers that you use that you haven't generated yourself, that you haven't designed yourself. There will be a copyright belonging to somebody else on that paper, and you know, depending where it came from, you might need to think very carefully about how you use it if you're going to go on and sell the projects that you're making. So do be aware of that. So before we move on to the examples and just ways to kick off some ideas in your head, let's just have a look at the different ways we can attach our papers to our projects, and there's lots of different things you can do. So let's have a look at just a few of them. And so, for instance, nice piece like this. I'm going to just tear it up a little bit. Now, a little trick on tearing that comes in quite handy. If you tear towards you, you get the core of the paper exposed, whereas the bit that you tore towards you, it's the top of the paper that's exposed. So that's quite handy to know when you want to, say, have the core exposed. So for instance, I tore that towards me. To do the same on this side, I'd have to turn it around and tear it towards me again. And then I've got a piece with the core exposed on both sides. So that's quite a handy little thing to remember. And one of my favourite ways, well, two of my favourite ways of sticking my found papers and my pattern papers are matte medium or with regular gel. And this is just a really good mixed media way of doing it because you can layer up on top of them. It's archival, so it is going to last, and also once you've stuck it down, it's going to stay there because matte medium and gels, they need quite a lot to get rid of them. So the way I do this is I'll put a layer on the surface, a layer on what I want to stick down, and then stick it onto the surface, and then put a layer on the top. And you can do this with a brush or you can do this with a palette knife. Doesn't matter which you use. So I'm not doing this particularly neatly, this is just as an example. So that's with matte medium. And if we do another one with gloss, so I do use golden for mine because I know that they're good quality, they're artist quality, they're archival, they're going to last, but so are ones that you get from Liquitex or other brands as well. Let's do this one with the top of the paper showing. So if I want to do that, I can just tear it away from me. Ta-da! Quite a clever little trick. And what I usually do is I buy these in bulk because they tend to work out more economical buying them in bulk, but that is because I do use them a lot. In fact, should we do this one with the brush? Just so that I can show you that you can use a brush as well. It's not, you know, it's just whichever one you prefer using. And usually I would put this, let me just put it down on another piece of paper here, rather than on my surface, and just cover the whole area with the gel medium or the matte medium. Put the two covered surfaces together and then just go over the top with another layer, and that's pretty put. And you can put acrylic over the top of that, you can put watercolour over the top of it, you can put crayons, you can do all sorts of stuff with that. So that's my favourite way of attaching any of my found papers or my pattern papers to a project. So the matte medium will dry matte, so it's just a different type of texture, and the gloss, the regular gel, I use the gloss because the gloss dries completely transparent, whereas if you use the matte or the semi-gloss, that can have a little bit of just a little bit of opaqueness to it. It can look a little bit cloudy. So I use gloss, but it will dry with a glossy finish to it. So depending on what kind of finish you want, choose whether you use matte medium or the regular gel gloss. So another way to attach your patterned paper is just using acrylic paint. It is basically a glue as well. So again, you can use your brush or you can use your palette knife, and this time I'm just going to lay it thickly on and then take a bit and put it down, and you can, if you want, add a little bit over the top or just press it down to get a good firm grip. And that comes in really useful when you're trying to add texture to a project. And we can do exactly the same with our found papers as well. So just stick that on there. I'll leave that up. There we go, and that will, once that's dry, that will be stuck in place. So there are a couple of my favourite methods for my mixed media projects, but there's other methods as well that you can use. So for instance, there's always tape, and washi tape's a favourite. Now depending on how your washi tape is and how sticky it is, you might need to put some other glue over the top to make sure it doesn't come up and it doesn't unstick. So what I often do with this is use it over the gel or use it with the matte medium, just to make sure it sticks in place. If you've got one that's very tacky, then you might not need to do that. And hey, what about just a paper clip? And you could have a shaped paper clip like this one, or go for an ordinary paper clip. So, and once we're on some things like that, then how about just stapling? And you can use the staple to add extra texture. And there's always things like glue sticks as well. So this is just an ordinary glue stick that you would find in any stationery shop. And you can find ones that are archival. Now, I don't believe that this one is particularly archival, but you know, if you do need it to be archival, then look out for those. And they make really handy and very quick ways of attaching whatever you're using to a page. So, not to be forgotten, the ordinary glue stick. And whilst we're at it, why don't we have a look at a few non-glue ways to attach our pieces together. So we looked at the staple, but there's also things like thread. And of course string as well. So you can always do things like punch holes into your page and your paper and then tie the pieces together, and that can be a very interesting way to do things. And you can also use your hole punch to add a few holes in there and make an almost stitched look to attach the paper to your project. And you can either tie it off at the back or the front as well, that can look good, or you can glue down the ends of your threads. And another method is to actually stitch the paper in place as well, and you can do this with just an ordinary needle and thread. I've got embroidery thread here, and it's kind of hard pushing the needle through the paper. So what I generally do is get a piercing tool and pierce the holes first and then do the stitching through that way. But another way I would do it is by using a sewing machine. So we've covered a few different ways in which to attach your found paper and your pattern paper to your projects, and let's just have a look at some examples of how to use the paper. So one of the ways that I like using pattern paper in particular, but also found papers as well, is in backgrounds. And there are just several ways that you can do this. If we have a look at this one, for instance, I've just used it in this particular background and then gone over the edges with, I believe this is the oil pencil, and then pulled it out with a little bit of water. And you can get some really great looks using it like this, in this kind of patchwork. And a lot of these are a little bit patchworky, so if you have a look at this one, for instance, where I've used it again in a patchwork, lots of pattern paper, and then gone over the top with gesso, and then done a sketch over the top. And that's just a really interesting way to use it. But that's kind of similar to this one, where I've done it as a flower. And in this one, I've also then blocked out around the flower as well. You can still see the pattern on it, and just adds a really lovely texture to your project. So these are ways I really love using this technique. And then let's have a look at this one as well. There's two different ones here. So here I've used just pieces of paper from one of my junk journals and glued it onto a mixed media paper, and then used paint to cover over the top. If I have a look closer, you can sort of see the lovely texture that you can get from the found papers, but I've also included it as part of some of the focal points on this page as well. So even the whole page is made up of the same paper. You can highlight areas of it and just make it part of the abstract. You can do that with found papers, you can do that with pattern papers. And then something like this, which is slightly different again, but the same sort of principle, and this time I've just used a small amount of patterned paper and put it in the background, and it kind of becomes like a hidden feature. So I've covered it up, it is the background, but if you look really closely, you can still see the pattern of that paper coming through. And it just adds another layer of texture, and then I've stamped over the top and added some different textures there as well. And this is another example of that, but slightly different. So I've used the papers in a very similar way, but instead of being the background, I've then actually made them a feature. So this is a feature page of pattern papers that I've then coloured over the top, but you can still see a little bit of the pattern coming through, and of course the shapes as well. So it's another great way of using your papers. And if we're going to talk about using them as features, there's loads of examples of how you can do that. So for instance, on this one, I've made this butterfly out of torn up pieces of pattern paper, then drawn over the top with it. Or something like this, where they become almost hidden features in a way. You've got some that are obviously just pattern papers, and then you've got some that you've actually gone in and they've been covered, but then they've been made a feature again by going in with that black line around them. Let's have a look at some more examples of very obvious patterned paper features. Something like this, where I've cut out letters from pattern paper and they become a major feature for this page. Or on this one, where I've actually used design that was on the page, and I believe these were journaling cards, and cut those out. I mean, butterflies, they lend themselves really well for features, don't they? But also I've got in the background some pattern paper as well. And then let's try this one. And here again, pattern paper where I've cut it up to make some abstract flower shapes for this flower cluster. And some more feature examples to get you in the mood. And again, two very similar types of things where I've used pattern papers and found papers as circles, and they become the major feature of these two pages. And you can kind of see it really doesn't take an awful lot. And in fact, I think this is just brown paper, if I remember rightly. And this is book page. And then on this one, these are pattern papers. And then something like this, which is another one of my favourite ways of using it. So there's a little bit of found paper in the background, and then this flower was actually drawn on an old book page, and that becomes the feature for this page, but it's reflected in what was down on the background. So let's have a look at these projects. So this is a handy hint. So if you ever have a page that sticks together, then you can just put a little piece of baking paper in between them and it will stop them from sticking. So I have bits of acrylic paint on here that just like sticking to itself. So I just use a paper clip to keep the baking sheet in place. And in this one, in fact in these, I've got a couple examples here where I've used this technique with paper to frame my focal image. So here's an old book page where I've done it, and then on this one I've drawn these orchids, but I've done it on some found paper, so that is from an envelope, and then that's a bit of note paper too. And that's another great way of just drawing the eye to a section. And then I've got another example in this book of that. Oh, not in this one. No, in this one. And that's this double page where again I've used some old map pages as frames for the focal images. It's just a neat trick of drawing the eye to where you want it to go, because you're adding a contrast. Let's just revisit the background, using them as background. So on this again I've used it as a patchwork and then drawn my focal image, but I've just used a little bit of paint around the outside of the focal image to knock that area back a little bit so that the focal image just pops out, but you've still got these other areas of the page just sort of like still popping out as well. So that's, you know, it doesn't take much to do this. This is just literally just some pattern paper, a pen and a little bit of paint. And we have a look at this one, and this is a very similar sort of thing to that one, but instead for this one I've actually used some pattern paper that I made myself. So if you don't have any pattern paper or you don't have any found paper that you want to use, then you could always use some of your old backgrounds as well, or just any bits of paper that you've coloured and added pattern to. And of course, if we're talking backgrounds and patterns, then there's the whale. Do you remember the whale from just a couple of videos ago on YouTube? And where I used, this is all pattern paper in the background, and then the whale itself was a collage of pattern paper too. So another way to have a go with this. And let's not leave backgrounds just yet, let's have a look at this one. And in this one, what's different about this one? Again, it's a patchwork of patterned papers. I've cut them out, stuck them together in a patchwork, but then gone over the top with a pen to draw out some of the pattern that was on the page, adding a little bit of interest. And again, it's just a really simple page, it's just pattern paper and a pen. And whilst we're here, you don't have to use it just for your art journaling or your mixed media projects. You can also use them for some what we call off-the-page projects as well. And a lot of people do this, as I'm sure you guys probably do as well. You make some of your own books and art journals with it. So here's a few examples of how you can use them in off-the-page. So let's just start with a really simple one, where I've just used some of the disc binding and a range of patterned paper, some of my leftover cut-offs from projects, and then art paper as well of various types, and just mixing it up a little bit, doing it with little different sizes and things like that, and it makes a really quick and easy art journal. So for these ones, I've just used single-sided patterned paper, folded them in two, trimmed them down a little bit, and then punched holes into the centre of them and just threaded ordinary embroidery thread. So you can use bookbinding thread if you've got it, but you know, you can also just use ordinary embroidery thread too. And if we move on to the most complicated book form, this one actually uses bookbinding techniques, and I've again used pattern paper, some found paper and artist paper to fill this book and the signatures, and it's a collection of signatures or pamphlets bound together. But it's the hard case that I really wanted to show, because on the hard case I've made some of my own DIY found papers, and it was really simple. So I wanted it to be Arabic to go with the theme, so I just wrote some passages in English and Google translated them into Arabic, and then cut and paste them into Word and printed them out on paper with just my ordinary inkjet. And then I just used a spray fixative to fix the ink to the paper, and after that I could just use them as I would use any sort of found paper. So there's some great ways of using your papers for books. But don't forget, you can use them in other projects as well, and they will go on fabric. So for instance, this is a tote that I've decorated, and underneath it there's a layer of found paper, and then I've just built up layers over the top with acrylic paint and some penwork. So there were just a few examples of how to use your pattern paper and your found paper in your projects, and there are many more examples of how you can use them. So just have a play and see what you can come up with, and hopefully it's kicked off some ideas in your head, so get you ready for your next art session. Now I've put links to some of the projects underneath this in the post that goes with this, so that if there's anything you wanted to dive a little bit deeper into, hopefully there's a project link there for you if I've got one, so either to a blog post or to a video. Feel free to ask any questions in the comments, and also feel free to share any of the projects that you make as well, because it would be great to see them. Right, I think that's it, so I'll catch you all again in our next art session. See you soon.